To me, the third space is the opportunity to amaze and delight with new skills. And I think we saw one of the best examples I've ever seen of third space thinking last week when Mark Zuckerberg was in China and was being interviewed in Mandarin and then was waiting for the translation and all of a sudden started answering the questions and doing the entire interview in Mandarin and got these amazing gasps from the audience. He didn't just do a sentence, it wasn't just a hello, he actually spoke Mandarin, and it was brilliantly stage managed that nobody knew ahead of time that he had learned Mandarin. He pointed out that his wife is Chinese and he couldn't communicate with his mother-in-law until he learned Mandarin. It's also interesting to note that Facebook is not allowed in China, and this certainly will not hurt the effort to pick up another 1.3 billion customers. But that's really an example, I think, of amazing and delighting and surprising. In my own work, I know 5% of what I need to know. I aspire to 10%, and I'll never get there. And in all the work I do with companies and governments around the world, talking about how you learn the skills you need, I don't presume to tell people what to do. But the one piece of advice I offer is I say your learning curve must be steeper than your action curve. Your job is to learn, study, get on Twitter even when you think it's the stupidest thing you've ever seen, which is what I thought in the beginning, to learn Google Glasses even though you look silly and the people who wear them are now called glass holes, to learn all of this technology and to be ahead of the curve. You don't have to have policies, you have to understand. And one last comment before we get into conversation. One of my favorite comments, which I think relates to this, was in 1999. Bill Gates was asked, who keeps you awake at night? Is it Time Warner? Is it Intel? And in his very arrogant, dismissive way, he said, I don't even think about those guys. You want to know who keeps me awake at night? It's two guys in a garage in the Silicon Valley. And he didn't even realize it, but those two guys were Larry and Sergey. And that garage has now become an historical landmark. And incidentally, there are now 3 garages in the Silicon Valley that are historical landmarks. The Larry and Sergey, the Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and the Hewlett-Packard garage of the 30s. But what's interesting is there's a lot more garages in the Silicon Valley. There's a lot more garages outside the Silicon Valley, and there are a lot more people all over the world, and there also now, I think, are a lot of women in garages all over the world. So we're going to see talent come from everywhere. So I am thrilled to have a conversation with Glenn Osaki. Let me do a short introduction, and let's get started. Glenn is the president of Asia for the MSL Group, the largest PR agency network in Asia in terms of owned offices and staff size. He's based in Shanghai and has been there since January of 2005. And while he's been there, he's seen the agency multiply from 20 employees to over 1,500 employees through a relentless focus on talent, which I think we'll learn a little bit about in our conversations. He's a frequent speaker on the core issues of talent and communications, keynoting just in the last 2 months at major forums in Beijing and Delhi. And I think we're going to talk about the world, but especially China and India. He received his MA in Public Relations from the USC School of Journalism, so you know how good he is. He has a daughter who received a bachelor's from Annenberg in May of 2014, and a son who is currently a junior at USC. So he's almost, since that money is coming from China, he's almost singularly making a difference in the balance of trade payments for the amount of money that's being moved from China to the United States. Thank you very much. So Glenn and I had a short conversation earlier this week, but we haven't met. So what I want to do is I really want to turn this into a one-on-one, as if we're talking at lunch, include you, and certainly you can interrupt at any time, and then we'll come to some questions. But I really want to probe a little bit as if we're just sitting down talking. All right, I'm done with this now. I'll focus on this one. Thank you. All right, but before we get into issues of Asia, your company is part of the Publicis Group.
Yes, that's correct.
And one of the large holding companies, one of the largest communications companies in the world. And earlier this week, Publicis made a $3.7 billion acquisition of Sapient. Yes. And a lot of people were saying they weren't exactly sure how that fit into Publicis, but the real attraction was the talent you were getting through Sapient. I don't know if you can tell us anything about that deal, but is this one of the ways you have to get talent now to acquire it and buy it rather than growing it? Or, well, tell us a little bit about the Sapient acquisition.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff, for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I hope that I can share some perspective from an international standpoint, particularly as it relates to Asia. But in terms of answering your first question about Sapient, I think you're absolutely correct about the reason for the deal. Now, a lot of people will talk about the digital transformation, and in my industry, public relations, journalism, marketing, advertising, digital is obviously key. Big data is a very important part of that. We heard Steve from IBM talking about data as one of the key factors. But if you really boil it down, I believe it is about the talent. Sapient has a workforce that is consisting of a lot of third space thinkers. And you know, the very interesting thing as it relates to me is that of Sapient's 13,000 employees, about 8,500 of them are based in India. So 65% of their workforce is in India, although most of the revenues of the company are not in India. So they're outsourcing, but they're finding the talent there. And actually, tomorrow I'm going to India. I spend a lot of time there, and I think that there are certain skills that exist amongst our colleagues in India that reflect upon third space talent thinking. There are other skills that exist in China. You talked about Mark Zuckerberg and the great play that he did in China recently. But I think that as we look at talent, we need to look for it in different ways. And we can't look in the same traditional places. We do need to train people differently. We need to get them with a different type of an educational background, and I know that's what we're here to talk about today.
One more thing, and then we'll get heavily into it. One more thing about Publicis. And you didn't make this deal, but the CEO of Publicis, Maurice Levy.
Sure.
And what's amazing, incidentally, this is a company that's been around since the 20s, and he's only the second CEO you've ever had.
That's correct, only the second CEO.
But Maurice, some people have noted his strategy, and I wonder if you see this, has been rather than to grow digital and to grow talent, to acquire it. And is that something you've seen?
Well, yes, it is both. We do need to grow the talent, and we are working very hard, but we can't grow it fast enough. So even in my own experience, being the public relations firm of Publicis Group, that growth that you mentioned from maybe 20 employees when I started to the 1,500, a lot of that came through acquisition. We made some very smart training and hires, strategic hires, but a lot of it came from acquiring the talent in key markets, and that's what has allowed us to become a leader in the marketplace. But that acquisition appetite is just something that really you have to consider where the talent is in those organizations, because that's what you're buying, especially in our industry. It's not anything about, it's not, there are not these capital assets, there's not manufacturing capability or technology, but you're really acquiring talent.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into it. So the Dean really laid out the third space phenomenon. I think made a great case. How much of that is an American problem or phenomenon, and how much of that is a global with some focus on Asia?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that it is very much of a global need. In our previous session, a lot of the discussion was about globalization and the role that if you have, I think Steve said, a designer in Korea, that person can be just as effective working across the globe. Or, you know, the example of needing to collaborate across different markets in Europe or the U.S. or India. It is very much of a global economy these days, and you can't avoid that. I think that the third space thinking, though, is something that many of those 5 attributes, those competencies, are a bit foreign in Asia. And so I think that we need this type of thinking more than perhaps in the U.S. because we're seriously lacking. I was making a note as I look at these 5 competencies, the areas of 360 thinking and intellectual curiosity, for example, are not really virtues that are taught in the educational system in many parts of Asia. You have a lot more rote learning, and that is not conducive for this type of holistic view of the world, or the ability to to look at a challenge with that type of curiosity. And I think that students that are coming from American universities are doing better at that, European as well, than we are in Asia. But then I think that there are some areas that Asian students, Asian employees are doing quite well. And in some respects, perhaps better than their counterparts here in the US. And I would say in the area of adaptability, the population in Asia is so adaptable because they are leapfrogging technologies.
Let's just talk about the population in Asia for a minute. Because you're talking about 2 countries, one 1.3 billion people, the other I think about 1.1 at the moment, but expected to surpass China. How does that affect this issue, that you're really looking at over 2 billion people to choose a labor force from?
Huge workforces to choose from. But I think some of the talent pickings are a little bit slim in this type of thinking.
But with that size, can't you always find, I mean, it's the role of the government to make sure they're all trained. But with over close to 2.5 billion people to choose from, can't you always find the people you want?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think there is a scarcity of the talent. Even there. Absolutely. And if you think about a market like India, I think that there are some things that they do very well. That the area of empathy, the availability of active listening, to be able to interpret other viewpoints, integrate those insights into problem solving. I think that our teams in India do that quite well, and I think that's part of the reason why Sapient has so many employees that they've recruited from the Indian market. I think in China, this area of cultural competence is actually quite good. And they have a concept called guanxi, similar to this concept in Japan of a meeting harmony, which allows them to think about the collective whole or the team environment, able to work respectfully of other cultures and orientations. And I think that those skills, they actually do pretty well. But it's funny when you mention about the government, particularly in China. They recognize the need for these types of skills that they're lacking, and they actually are coming to USC. I know that Dean Wilson has recently started some different initiatives in terms of teaching the Central Party some of these types of skills. And
Dean Wilson's training the whole world.
But that's exactly what they need. They need these kinds of more soft power skills that can come from a communications discipline. It's not about the coercion and strong military, all those things that, of course, China has, but there is a realization that these types of skills are essential in those markets.
So I want to really be careful about stereotypes. But in the 1980s, a lot of Americans were concerned that Japan was taking over the world. And that was an era when lots of people were learning Japanese. And the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center and Pebble Beach, and it all turned out to be pretty bad investments. But one of all the industries they went in, and we know that before Korea and before China, they had really become dominant in the automotive business, dominant in the electronics business. But a lot of people said there was something in the Japanese character, and this is where I want to be careful of the stereotypes, where they couldn't be creative. For example, when they wanted to get into the movie business, Sony went and bought an American studio, Columbia. Big mistake was putting Peter Guber in charge, but bought an American, and then Matsushita, Panasonic, bought Universal. And the argument was that something of all the skills the Japanese have, and they are extraordinary skills, we've seen that, it didn't include the ability to work alone in a room on a creative script. I don't know if that's true, but I'm curious your reaction, and whether there's a parallel in China or India. But start with Japan. You must know that well.
Well, I think at that time, there was the desire to acquire, to invest more, to learn these skills from the West, because clearly in the U.S., these areas and places in areas of technology, certain entertainment, I mean, nobody can compete with what we see here in the United States. And
why do you think, is that something that we just had more experience, or is that something in our character?
I think that there's something in the nature to an extent. I also don't want to stereotype, because I think that nowadays, from an entertainment, for a cultural perspective, in terms of music and film, we see some amazing achievements in places like Japan, things like animation. In Korea, popular culture has really taken this K-pop, and the Korean dramas have really taken all of Asia by storm, and I know are becoming very, very popular here in the U.S. So I think it was more about the development, because the entertainment industry had developed much faster here in the U.S. It would take time for those industries to develop in parts of Asia, and so they came to the experts, and now we're seeing those industries develop faster.
And
same thing in China.
Does the political system play a role? Does the fact that some expression is heavily restrained in China? India has still a very strong caste system, which diminishes, or in some cases eliminates, mobility. Has that affected some of these third space skills?
Enormously so.
And the caste system doesn't look like it's going away anytime
soon.
The Chinese government doesn't look like it's opening completely anytime soon.
Yeah.
So what are the
So here's what I think some of the consequences of that. We start with India. So you do have a democracy there, but it's not a very well-functioning democracy. You have a terrible infrastructure, you have a caste system, that you have more haves and have-nots, and that disparity is greater in that market than in any of our other markets in Asia and perhaps in the world. And that will create issues, no question about it. And that's actually one of the reasons why India is not developed at the pace that China has.
Are we headed down that path with income inequality, do you think?
In India?
No, in America. Are we headed down the path of a small group of very rich people and a growing
I think we've
lower and lower middle class?
We've always had that to an extent, but not at the level that you see in India, the poverty levels, and the fact that you cannot have, many of the people in that system can never escape from that. And it's a big challenge. I think that there are some initiatives that are taking place to try to address it, but it will take generations and generations.
And I interrupt you. You were finishing India, and I think getting to China.
China, the situation, is extremely profound, because the government has such a stronghold, and all of the media, for example, are government-owned. Even those that aren't technically government-owned are influenced by the government. The government develops the agenda for the media in China. Even the international press are kind of there on the whim of the Chinese government, and they recognize how they need to operate. And so, yes, there is a challenge. But what we're seeing is that the impact of social media, you're right, we don't have Facebook in China, but we have,
Weibo and
WeChat in particular, that have been revolutionizing the market. And In China, perhaps more than any other market, that ability to express themselves is something that the consumers now hold dear. So there's an example, I think, so John, when you were giving one of the quotes about, that was from a study that we recently produced about millennials, and you said that 83% of millennials want businesses to do more and to be more active in solving the problems of the world. That 83% is more above 90% in China, and the most important or most interesting fact of that study related to this point is that China is the one market in the world, and I think we surveyed 17 countries where the people said, the millennials, said that they wanted the information about what the businesses were doing. They are seeking this transparency that goes beyond what people in the US or in Western Europe are demanding. So millennials are going to be driving so much of the business decisions, our approach to citizenship, the environment, so many other things. And the Chinese millennials, because they feel empowered with social media and WeChat and Weibo and different apps that allow them access and a voice that they've never had since the Cultural Revolution, they're ready for it. And so we're seeing a tremendous shift there, and it's really exciting. And there is an opportunity, and there's a huge opportunity, as Dean Wilson knows, in China for us, for the university, for businesses to take full advantage. And the fact is, if we don't, then the millennials, the younger population, will be unforgiving about that. And the government recognizes that they need to channel. See, it's very safe for the government to do that.
What happens when millennials become unforgiving? Tell me, how do they assert that?
Okay,
what does that mean for the rest of us?
The Chinese government is very smart about certain things, where they will allow millennials to speak out against businesses. The government takes a certain approach about corruption, because they want to make sure that the Chinese consumers are directing their anger or their frustration towards business or towards certain other things that are unrelated to the government. Because the government, you see this in Hong Kong recently, they have a certain power and authority that they want to maintain, but they recognize that with 1.3 billion people, if the people were to rise up, they'd have a lot of trouble. So it's kind of like, social media is sort of like, if you use an analogy of like a balloon. So, when you put air in a balloon, at some point, it's going to pop. And the Chinese consumers are sort of like that. When the tensions rise and the people are starting to feel a bit like the government is not allowing certain freedoms that they want, then the government encourages them to let out some of the air of that balloon, that they can then direct that towards businesses. I mean, we happen to work with many of the leading American companies in China, a company like a Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble or Walmart. And that's when the government will channel some of the certain issues that they will direct towards these companies, making it difficult for them to do business, and then they'll allow consumers to be negative against these companies so that the government then can stay clear. So it's a matter of knowing how to manage the population so that they're not going to be putting their anger in the wrong places. And I do believe that social media is something that the government has become extremely smart at managing. They have so many people that are monitoring every conversation, every SMS, every phone call, and they know there's the great firewall of China truly exists. And there are hundreds of thousands of people that are monitoring this so that they know where people's concerns are today and how to alleviate some of the pressure so that it's not directed at at them.
That's really interesting. Now, you're welcome to knock this argument down, but my sense has been that the Chinese government made a deal with the people 30 years ago and said, you support our system and we'll raise you out of poverty. And I think have done a better job than any civilization in the history of the earth.
Without question.
In taking hundreds of millions. And now those people who were peasants have cars in the garage, take vacations, and are middle class. But I think they're now looking around saying, why is my air so dirty? Why can't I say what I want? Is that deal going to last into the future?
Yeah, it will, at least for another generation. So I've had some conversations with people in China about what they think about democracy, for example. And there is a certain perspective that is not a Western perspective. You have to understand where the people are coming from, what their context is. I think this relates to the talent equation. We've gotten a little bit of a tangent here, Jeff, but there is definitely this perspective that exists from many people in China that they don't want to screw it up. And so that some people don't believe that they're ready yet for a democracy or elections, and that maybe some of the, and this is not my opinion, I'm just sharing because I talk to a lot of people in the market about where they think it's going and when will this happen. And this strong central party, the Communist Party, recognizes that they probably have another generation before the people will start to really feel frustrated. Now, there are certain symptoms that are a problem, like the environment, the air pollution in Beijing or Shanghai. Some of these matters, but the government is working extremely hard on that. And they have a great plan for economic empowerment in terms of business. You know, they are not a communism that we view in the West of what a communist system is from an economic
It is a
perspective.
tangent. I appreciate you going out on it. We won't stay there, but I thought that was really interesting.
Okay.
So let's get back on track.
Sure.
What are the differences between Chinese and Indian millennials and American or European millennials? Do they have their noses buried, or are they walking down the street bumping into people because they're looking at their smartphones?
Well, yes, actually they are probably even more so. So Asia is the most mobile region in the world. So there are more countries in Asia where people are using mobile technology, smartphones, to get onto the internet or to chat than there are anywhere in the world. So there are more people there that are using mobile technology than they're using their computers.
We had an intern come into our office on Monday from China Unicom, the third biggest mobile company in China, and they have 250 million users. And they're the third biggest. So no.
Yeah, but the smartphone usage, I mean, the adoption in places like Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, China, and Korea, all of those markets, people use their smartphones more to access the internet and go online than they do a computer. And they've sort of leapfrogged over that computer to their smartphones. And so mobile applications and the technology is so far advanced in Asia than it is here in the US. And some of we talked about WeChat, and that's just one mobile messenger service that many of you probably have. You're familiar with WhatsApp, but WeChat is so much more powerful because you can do essentially everything from calling a taxi to paying your bills to ordering airline tickets or movie theater tickets to meeting friends, chatting. I mean, every element of your life almost you can do on WeChat. And people in China don't exchange business cards anymore. They just exchange WeChat. And you shake your phone and that's how you meet people in the room. And so it is extremely pervasive. But in Japan, you have the same thing happening with Line. In Korea with Kakao Talk. In India with Ye. So you have all of these mobile messenger services that are becoming the key form of communications. And if you are a Facebook, or we talked a lot about Google, they're at risk of losing a lot of market share or a lot of business opportunity because of what's happening with these types of technologies. And that's why, when I mentioned the adaptability of millennials, of these consumers, these students in Asia, they are ready. They're going to be leapfrogging and moving much faster, and they're innovating so quickly that a company like Apple has to watch out for what's happening in these markets in Asia. And I think it's a good lesson for all of us that in this global economy, we need to be recognizing, what's happening. Most of the growth in the world, I think 60% of the GDP growth is coming from Asia. Our company is sort of unique because we are, I think, the largest PR firm in Asia. But more unique is that 1/3 of our revenue today comes from Asia. All the growth, essentially, of MSL Group, this global PR firm, comes from Asia. And actually, so 1/3 of the revenue and probably more than that of the profit. And this is where I think businesses are going, and you're going to see more and more emphasis placed on Asia, because these are the markets, the ones that I mentioned, the ones that are growing and innovating and becoming strong leaders.
Incidentally, feel free to interrupt my interruptions anytime you want. But let's stay with millennials for a minute.
Sure.
So you talked about how important mobile, how important social is. Does that, a lot of American employers think that gets in the way of this third space training, of this ability to really learn? It becomes a complete distraction. And one of the things we've seen in our global work is among millennials, 2/3 of them, if they have a choice of where to go to work, will not go to a place that restricts social media use while they're at work. Do you find this gets in the way of developing these skills?
Well, no. I mean, from one standpoint, yes, it's frustrating when you're in a meeting and everybody is on their phones, and it feels
of course, nobody here is doing that.
It feels like they're probably not even paying attention. But the fact of the matter is that they are paying attention. So they have an ability to work across multiple media, whether it's voice and watching a screen.
This is what they say. This has not been tested yet. They say they can truly multitask.
We should do.
I'm suspicious.
You can't cut that out. It has become such a part of their life. And if their performance, their productivity is high, and you can create a way to use that mobile technology, to use those apps. So many companies have their own apps now in China, so that they can connect their people in a closed environment everybody uses WeChat in that capacity. Weibo itself isn't even that. Weibo is like the Twitter of China. That's not as popular because it's an open platform where everybody can have access, and you could just send it out to everywhere. And WeChat is a closed platform, so it's just amongst those people that are your friends or your businesses or those that you want to allow into it. So it's sort of what the power is of WeChat. But I think it's something that is impacting the millennials. We have to keep that in mind. There's a couple other things about millennials that I think are important for us that are reflective of third space thinking. Millennials care more about the what versus the why. Why matters, but they don't want, they don't care about talking. They care about doing and acting. And so when I'm talking about millennials, these are the people that were born from like the early 80s to 2000. So they're probably in this age 15 to 30, early 30s. And so these millennials care about more of the micro than the macro, actually. They want tangible results. They're not about the philosophy or promises, but they are very much about the tangible results.
But are we focusing too much on them? They're going to come to work for me. It's more important, I think, that they pay attention to what I think than what they think. Are we coddling them by saying this is what? I'm a boomer. When I went to work, I basically did what I was told, learned it, and then when I got in a position of authority, I could assert my own views and attitudes. Are we coddling them with?
Coddling it or not, we have to come to the realization that that's where the workforce is going to be. I think 60–70% of the workforce in the next 5 years will be considered millennials. So you have to be ready to adapt to.
But they need the jobs too. So
Yeah, but we need the talent, and I thought it was great.
Well, that's the trade-off.
Dinesh was
that's how we get the talent.
That is it in the session with John? Is it ideas or is it the talent? And you know, if it comes down to it, it is the talent, and we need them. Yes, they need a job, but you know, we have to figure out how we can create the right environment, the culture. Love the discussion from the earlier session about culture. That's critical. And that's what the third space thinking is about.
Let's talk about educational systems for a minute.
Okay.
On test scores throughout the world, Shanghai always ends up at the very top. And first, is the American K through 12 system as bad as we fear it is? And how good is the overall system, not just at the most elite schools in China and India, but across the system? And what do American systems still do well, and what do the Chinese systems do best?
There is a different value set in Asia, of course. I mean, it's true of China, absolutely, but you can see that in many other markets that has a tremendous value placed on education. I mean, parents will, you know, they will invest all of their time and resources and money to make sure that their kids get the proper education, and that's their biggest priority in life.
Is the tiger mom a real phenomenon?
Oh, sure.
In China? We know the tiger mom in America, the stereotype at least, but there are tiger moms in...
It definitely exists.
Are there tiger moms in India?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but the problem, I think, is that what I mentioned earlier about some of the types of learning. You said test scores in Shanghai
are the highest in the world.
Highest in the world. My kids went to high school in Shanghai.
That's how they got into USC.
Exactly. But it's the type of learning that they're getting that are giving them good test scores, but they're not giving them the third space type thinking. That's not 360 thinking. You have to find the right balance. And this is the big challenge for us today and over the next few months, is to figure out how we can develop that so that it's not about the test scores. That can't be the only thing that we are evaluating the students on. And if it is, then it will continue to churn out the same kinds of students, and then people like me in the business world will have to train them and have a hard time finding them.
So China obviously has had an economic miracle since the 80s. Yeah. So assuming China doesn't embrace the third space, what's going to go wrong? Because so far it looks like everything's going right. What do you see will happen if these skills that we've learned about all morning don't become part of the Chinese culture?
Well, I see that they are becoming more and more part of it. So in many of the discussions, and if you read some of the the government's 3-year plan, you listen to what Xi Jinping talks about, he recognizes the value of, he talks about these soft skills, he talks about creating the right type of an environment. I think that China gets it. I think that they want to be competitive. They want to stay, what they believe, on top of the world, or get to the top of the world in many areas, and they have plans against everything. But I think the openness that we are seeing in some of the initiatives that, again, USC is doing with universities in Beijing and in Shanghai, demonstrate that the top universities see the need for this. And I think that there's an opportunity there to create a very, very powerful bridge between China and the US, or the US and India, based on this thinking. I'm maybe one of the few representatives in the room today that spends most of his time, almost all of his time, in Asia. But I think we should have more and more people like this. And I know the USC has a global conference coming up in Shanghai next year. I would suggest that this become a key topic, that we have certain memorandums of understanding that are produced and developed in conjunction with Chinese universities. It could be a great, very exciting seminal moment in 2015, if we do some of the right things today, and maybe this is the challenge that I would throw to Ernie and the rest of the group, that there is a need for it. We have an opportunity. Businesses like mine and many of yours in the room will see the need for this type of thinking, and I think that Annenberg is on the forefront.
And for those who are not familiar, USC has more international students than any university in America. So
more from China than any university. Yeah, and as we are seeing that business has to reinvent itself, every company, mine is in the in the public relations business. We do a lot with publicity or journalism, things with, working with key stakeholders and things. But we are having to reinvent our business day in and day out. We have a big initiative launching this month. It's called Project Change at my company, because we recognize that the way we're doing business today is good, and maybe we're leading in certain aspects of our industry, but it's not going to allow us to continue to lead over the next 3 to 5 years. So we're changing. In order to change, we need different types of talent. We need to hire different types of entry-level students. We need people with a different kind of background if we're going to reinvent ourselves. And we need to find people with these kinds of third space talents.
You just did the executive summary of the whole argument brilliantly. Glenn, I'm told we're out of time, excuse me. I'm out of town soon.
Yeah, you're going out of town.
We're out of time. I interrupted you endlessly. I took you in directions you probably didn't think I was going to take you in.
That was a conversation. You set that up from the beginning,
tangents,
so it was fun.
But I thought you were great. I thought it was a great way to do a conversation.
Thank you very much, Jeff. My pleasure.